Everybody, my name is Wes Franklin. I'm a grad student in the environmental sciences program at Ball State University working on my PhD. And my research deals primarily with spatial management and compliance with marine protected areas. Today I'm going to present to you our project, Angler Compliance with Rockfish Conservation Areas in British Columbia, Canada, in response to awareness efforts and COVID-19. So before I get into rockfish conservation areas, I'd like to talk more generally about marine protected areas and spatial management. So marine protected areas are areas set aside by state and federal governments that have varying levels of protection from human activity. These areas were developed for many different reasons, one of the main reasons being in response to overfishing, as scientists and fishermen noticed that they were recording less and less catch over previous decades. Some other reasons include preservation of important habitats and conservation of biodiversity. The science behind the MPA is that if you take an area and leave it alone, don't allow any human extraction from that area will begin to rebound and will start to flourish, and the biomass in that area will increase and then potentially spill out into other areas. Currently, about 7% of the oceans are under some sort of conservatory protection. I have protected in here in quotation marks because many of these areas have not yet been implemented, or if they have been implemented, they're not fully protected areas, so they allow minimal to very extensive human extraction. And research predicts that 30% of the oceans need to be under full or high protection. So MPAs, once they are implemented and if they are enforced and effective, they can have so many benefits. One of those being conservation of biodiversity, not just for struggling fish stocks, but for other things like transient marine mammals, marine reptiles, and marine invertebrates, things like that. They also protect hotspots of biodiversity, so things like coral reefs, seagrass beds, hydrothermal vents, areas where nurseries are going to happen, where fish stocks are going to rely on juvenile recruitment, and things like that. These areas can also serve as natural research areas for scientists. So once you have these areas set aside and they start functioning like a normal ecosystem, scientists can go in here and observe interactions that they might not be able to get in fished out areas. They also serve as a potential insurance policy for fisheries. So overfished fisheries have the likelihood to crash at some point, and we've seen this throughout history. So if you have an area set aside where you have just fish stocks that have not been uninterrupted by humans, then these areas can serve as an insurance policy in case something does crash. They also serve as important areas to rebound threatened, endangered species and species that are listed of concern. Also, once these areas are established, biomass will begin to grow, and then you have the potential for a spillover of fish stocks out into unprotected areas, and then the fisheries around these areas can benefit from this, and it will also benefit the ecosystems of these unprotected areas as well. And then speaking to that as well, you have the potential for a dispersal of propagules and eggs. This is known as translocation. So similar to a spillover of fish, when you have biomass increasing and egg production increasing, it can spill out into other areas and begin to reestablish some fish stocks in other areas as well. And lastly, there are a lot of economic and recreational benefits from MPAs, especially in areas that rely heavily on fishing. If they can switch their economies into relying on marine tourism, that can substitute some of their economic development. So this is our study area located in southeastern Canada and British Columbia, and more specifically in the Strait of Georgia, which I'll call the SOG from now on. About 144 of the 164 RCAs in Canada are located in the Strait of Georgia, which is also known as inside waters, and that's where all the RCAs that we looked at for our study. So, rockfish conservation areas, like I said earlier, there's 164 in Canada right now, 144 located in inside waters. They were developed between 2004 to 2007 by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, with the goal of rebounding struggling and threatened rockfish populations. These areas are no-take zones for all commercial fishing and most recreational fishing, although they do allow some types of recreational fishing, including fishing by First Nation groups and individuals, and recreational fisheries with minimal impact to rockfish populations. So, why are rockfish a concern? Rockfish are a very important ecological and economic species in Canada, and they've been a target for recreational fishing since recreational fishing started in Canada. In the 1990s, scientists began to notice that rockfish populations were decreasing as they were being caught less and less by fishermen. Not because the effort of fishing was going down, but because the rockfish populations were going down. This is happening for several different reasons. The increase in rockfish mortality and their decrease in their numbers. One of those being that rockfish are long-lived species. They have a very long lifespan. Some species of rockfish can live up to and over 100 years old, which is a long time. Because of this, they have a later age of reproduction and a later age of maturity. So if you have rockfish that are being caught before that age of reproduction, they have no chance to pass on offspring to the next generation. They're not going to contribute to the next generation. So that's going to lead to low recruitment and low production for that next generation, and then declining fish stocks as well. Another reason is that rockfish generally have limited home ranges. So because of this, if you have a lot of localized overfishing, these rockfish populations can become extirpated, which just means they can become locally extinct because of the amount of overfishing locally. And lastly, these species are subject to barotrauma. So barotrauma is a pretty nasty phenomenon. Rockfish are a deep water species that have a physocyclistic swim bladder, just meaning that their swim bladder is not directly attached to their esophagus. So because of this, when a rockfish is pulled up from deep water, the pressure builds up inside of the rockfish's swim bladder. That pressure has nowhere to go, that gas, and so it will just push on other internal organs and can cause a lot of internal organ damage. And as you see here in this image, this is actually a rockfish's stomach protruding out of its mouth because it got pushed out by the swim bladder. So this alone can kill a rockfish, and then if the rockfish is released on the surface, it's all bloated up and it has no way to overcome that pressure differential, and it'll just float on the surface and die. So that, coupled with the limited home range and the long lifespan and late reproductive age of rockfish, are all reasons why we have high rockfish mortality and declining rockfish numbers. And it's also why many or several rockfish are listed as species of concern. So here are a few of the species of concern that we have in Canada. All of these are inshore rockfish species, which we find in rockfish conservation areas inside the Strait of Georgia. And they're all species that rockfish conservation areas are trying to rebound their populations and curb that downward trend of mortality. So I won't read all of them, but one of the most important and struggling the most is yellow eye rockfish in the top left corner up here. So switching from rockfish conservation areas, background from them to what research is actually being done to see how rockfish populations are doing. In 2016, this paper was published by Dana Haggerty and her collaborators. Lack of recreational fishing compliance may compromise effectiveness of rockfish conservation areas in British Columbia. And what they wanted to do was look at fishing effort in and around rockfish conservation areas from 2003 to 2011. So this study was pretty cool because most marine protected area research does not have any data from before the implementation of that marine protected area. So they can't really draw any conclusions about how fish stocks might have been before. They can just say, like, they're looking good now, and this could be tied to a marine protected area, but it could be tied to something else. So for Dana's research and for our research, we actually have data from before the introduction of RCAs, so we can make some firm conclusions about how RCAs can be affecting fish populations. So they collected data from flyover krill surveys, which is just they would have observers on planes looking down on these areas and seeing if people were fishing or not. So they collected this data from 2003, 2007, and 2011 in 77 different RCAs, and then they compared the rates of fishing effort in those times, and they also found what geographic variables might be influencing compliance in and around these rockfish conservation areas. Some of those geographic variables include some easy ones like the size of an RCA, the perimeter to area ratio, and then some other things like the distance to cities, the distance to popular fishing lodges, and the number of hours enforced by conservation officers, things like that. So some of the things that they found was that legal fishing, so this was just total fishing in the Strait of Georgia, decreased from their data collected in 2003 to 2011. They found that illegal fishing, so this would be fishing inside of the RCA, increased from 2003 to 2007. and then it decreased from 2007 to 2011. So it looks like compliance was getting better, and that's great, but this can't be tied directly to the effectiveness of rockfish conservation areas, since total fishing efforts in the Strait of Georgia decreased from 2003 to 2011. Next, they found that of the 77 RCAs analyzed, only a total of 5 had a decrease in fishing effort from the data collected in 2003 to 2011. They found that there were several variables that influenced compliance, some of those being the number of hours enforced by conservation officers, size to perimeter ratio of an RCA, the size of an RCA, the distance to fishing lodges, and the amount of fishing that was taking place in a 1 kilometer buffer directly next to the RCA. So they found that if fishermen were fishing right next to the RCA, they were more likely to stray into that RCA and fish. They also found that lack of awareness was a big factor influencing compliance, and this is seen ubiquitously throughout marine protected area research, that if there's no awareness or education about a rockfish conservation area, people don't know why to fish, why not to fish there, they don't know where the boundaries are, that it's going to get illegally fished. And they also found that effectiveness of RCAs is directly linked to for an RCA to be effective, it has to have high non-compliance. So, and that makes sense as well, and it's also seen throughout marine protected area research. If an area is not compliant, if there's a lot of illegal fishing going on in a conservation area, then you're not going to reap the benefits from that area, and it's not going to be effective. It basically might as well be a non-protected area. So, to speak more about the lack of awareness that they found that 67% of non-compliance was unintentional. Over 25% of anglers had never heard of RCAs. 60% of anglers didn't know where these RCAs were located. 40% of anglers believe that salmon fishing was permitted, and 23% believe that halibut fishing was permitted. So once again, it wasn't so much that people were trying to go out and illegally poach. It was just that there's not much signage out there. There wasn't much awareness. There was no enforcement, so that it's likely to get illegally fished. So our research, what we are doing, we are looking at data from 2019 to 2021. So the last data that Haggerty collected for her analyses was from 2011. So we want to see if compliance had increased or decreased from 2011 to 2019. We also wanted to know how compliance varied between years 2019, 2020, and 2021. And lastly, we wanted to know what variables might have influenced compliance between these years. We wanted to know if they were similar to the variables that were significant for Haggerty, or if it was something completely different. And also, COVID-19 hit during the years 2020 and 2021. So we wanted to know if that had any impact on angler habits. We see in other areas of research that illegal activity increased during COVID. So we wanted to know if that affected angler habits and how they might have reacted differently as tourism wasn't as high and there might have been more local fishermen out. So that was the objectives we had for this research. So some of the things that we found, this box plot on the left shows illegal fishing in the black and legal fishing in the gray. So on the left is 2011. We see that illegal fishing was quite high in 2011. And then in 2019, illegal fishing was very low. Compliance was very high. And this can be tied to increases in awareness and outreach and just effective RCAs. So this is a very successful year for rockfish conservation areas. Then this box plot on the left shows overall fishing effort from 2003 to 2021, same thing. Fishing inside of the RCA is in the black, and then fishing outside of the RCA is in the gray. So we see from 2003 to 2011 compliance wasn't that great, and then in 2019 compliance increased a lot. It was very successful, and then the pandemic hit and compliance dropped back down. Illegal fishing increased. So compliance wasn't as good in 2020 and in 2021 as it was in 2019. But we do see that the trend starts to get a little bit better, and we hope that it stays that way so that these rockfish conservation areas are going to stay effective. All right, so in 2019, compliance was pretty good, but there were still some areas where non-compliance ran rampant a little bit. And these areas were near tourist centers or popular tourist fishing areas, such as fishing lodges. And then in 2020 and 2021, we see that flip-flops because there wasn't as much tourist fishing because of the pandemic, but there were more locals out fishing. And so we see that illegal activity was higher in many areas of research during the pandemic, and this might have been true for our local populations as well. But there was also a larger amount of new fishermen out on the water, so they might not have been as aware of the local laws and things like that. So going forward, the results we have so far are preliminary. So we're working on really polishing up this data and trying to find out what geographic variables might have had an influence on compliance in 2019 to 2021. We also want to find out what role COVID played and how important it was for this project. And also we want to know what insights we can gain from COVID, because when COVID hit in every aspect of life, it really shook things up a lot and showed us how we can do things better. And that's the same here for angler compliance. We want to know how we can react if some other kind of disaster happens and how we can be ready for that. We also are working on finishing drafting this manuscript so that we'll be able to publish our findings by 2023. That's the plan. So things we can draw from the research done and from this presentation is that high rates of compliance are possible, as we saw in 2019. We saw that compliance rates during 2020 and 2021 during the pandemic were lower than they were in 2019, so illegal fishing was worse. We know that without monitoring, education, awareness, and enforcement, the compliance will not drop back down to pre-pandemic levels. We know throughout what our data shows and throughout marine protected area research that you need to have enforcement and awareness of areas in order for them to be effective. So this means in normal years we need to address issues with our tourist fishing. So in areas that tourists are likely to fish, that we know they're going to fish, we need to have signage up, we need to have enforcement officers there, and we need to make sure that the tourists coming in are aware of the local laws and they're aware of why illegal fishing is so detrimental for the environment. And then flip that, during abnormal years, such as a pandemic or something else, we need to address issues with our local fishing populations, and we need to have high awareness and outreach and enforcement near our high population centers. So this means that in rockfish conservation areas near high population centers, we need to have enforcement officers out, we need to have signage up, and we need to make sure that the local populations are aware of where these areas are, and they know the same thing, why illegal fishing is so bad for the environment and why rockfish populations are important. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for listening. I hope y'all got something out of this, and get out there and save nature, guys.